Today, we're diving into a truly epic story, one that spans thousands of years. We're going to see how the basic needs of the world's very first empires, things like security, resources, and just keeping order, actually set the stage for one of the most cynical wars in all of human history. A war fought not over land or gold, but over a simple cup of tea.
It sounds a little crazy, right? What could possibly connect the Roman legions of Augustus Caesar with the sailing ships of the British Empire fighting over tea? Well, the answer is fascinating. It's all about a timeless, universal pattern of power, of desire, and, well, the absolutely desperate things empires do when they can't get what they want.
So to really understand this war, we have to go way, way back to the very beginning. We need to ask a really fundamental question. Where do empires even come from? Turns out there's kind of a recipe for it. Okay, let's really get into this. See, empires aren't just historical accidents, and they're not just about one power-hungry ruler. They're actually the logical next step when a society gets really good at solving two huge problems. First, how to handle all its success, and second, how to protect that success from everybody else.
And here is that recipe, broken down into 3 steps. Step 1, you get really, really good at farming. You produce way more food than you need. That's your agricultural surplus. Step 2, you need people to manage all that extra food and an army to protect it. That gives you a government and a military. And that third final step, you use that organized power to expand, to grab more land, more resources, and more people to keep your whole system growing. And boom, that right there is how an empire is born.
Now, what's so wild is that this exact same recipe has been used over and over and over again throughout history. It creates this really predictable cycle, a massive rise to power, a long period of just total dominance, and then the inevitable decline. Let's take a look. This timeline just lays it all out perfectly. You've got Cyrus the Great forging the Persian Empire, then Alexander the Great, then Augustus making Rome a powerhouse. Fast forward to Genghis Khan and his unstoppable armies. And finally, Queen Victoria, ruling over an empire where the sun famously never set. They all followed the same recipe, but here's the kicker. They all met the same end. They got too big, spread themselves too thin, and eventually started to fall apart.
And it's right here, with one empire at its absolute peak, Britain, and another in a slow, long decline, Qing Dynasty China, that our story really kicks off. And the conflict didn't start with soldiers and cannons. It began with a basic but massive economic problem, a total standoff.
So everything hinges on this really simple idea from the world of bartering. For a trade to work, I have to want what you've got, and you have to want what I've got. It sounds completely obvious, right? But when that simple rule fails on a global scale between two empires, things get really, really dangerous.
And this is exactly what happened. The British were absolutely obsessed with Chinese tea, not to mention silk and porcelain. They couldn't get enough. But China, this huge, self-sufficient empire, just looked at all the stuff Britain was making and basically said, no thanks, we're good. The only thing they wanted from the West was silver. This created a huge, disastrous trade imbalance, with silver just pouring out of Britain's treasury on every ship that came back with tea.
Now, an empire at the height of its power is not going to accept that kind of economic beatdown. Britain had to find something, anything, that China would actually buy. And when they couldn't find a product, they decided they would create a market for one, by force. Just stop and think about that question for a second. If an entire nation has zero interest in anything you're selling, how do you make them want something? How do you just manufacture demand out of thin air? Well, the British Empire came up with a truly sinister answer.
Opium. It was grown for next to nothing in British-controlled India, and it was the perfect, horrible solution to their problem. It was cheap to produce, easy to smuggle, and most important of all, it was incredibly addictive. Britain's new game plan was simple. If the Chinese people wouldn't willingly buy a British product, then they would be made to crave one.
And just look at the result. This table says it all. Before the opium trade really took off, there was a river of silver flowing in one direction, out of Britain and into China. But after Britain flooded the country with narcotics, that river of silver did a complete 180 and started flowing back to Britain. The perverse solution had worked. It was devastating Chinese society, but it balanced Britain's imperial budget.
Of course, China fought back. They tried to stamp out the opium trade, which is what started the Opium Wars. But they lost, and they lost badly. And that defeat wasn't just the end of a war. It was the beginning of a new, incredibly painful chapter for China, an era whose legacy is still shaping our world right now, as we speak.
You can capture that legacy with a single number, 100. This represents what's known in China as the Century of Humiliation. It was this long, dark period of foreign control, unfair treaties, and national weakness that all began with their loss in the Opium Wars.
And you can draw a straight line from that trauma to the China we see today. The pain of that century literally became the blueprint for modern China. Think about it. The vulnerability they felt to foreign powers back then, that created today's obsessive drive for technological self-sufficiency. The commercial submission they were forced into, that has fueled their aggressive global economic expansion now. The wounds of the past became the strategy for the future.
And that leaves us with this incredible question. What if China had won? Would a victory have allowed it to modernize on its own terms? Or, and this is the really challenging part, did that crushing defeat, that century of humiliation, actually provide the fire they needed to become the global superpower we see today? It's a profound thought that the ghosts of old empires and a desperate thirst for a simple cup of tea are still drawing the map of our 21st century world.